Yeah, so this is just going to be some general comments on the South African political situation, but is also going to be talking about the culture wars and identity politics and those kinds of matters, because I do think that uh, what is being missed in the great resolution to I think the intellectual toxicity or the real deep cause of the current miasma and the general ill of our time and in the zeitgeist um, is uh, I think South Africa is a very special case. It is in some sense the ground zero for the thematic or philosophical or political, sort of it is the most prominent, sort of patient zero where these issues are at their most sophisticated and well developed. And they're kind of in their most extreme case in the South African case. Um, so, yeah, I think that what has gone wrong in South Africa, and so the South African case was already, let's say, intellectually developed and more refined than, let's say, the framework of the culture wars in America, because I do think America is, in some sense, endem, endemically vulnerable and susceptible to the culture war, which is in some sense a kind of a particular, in the way that South Africa has caught on identity politics, which is, existed before the culture war in America, perhaps even. At least in the South African example, it is a direct refutation of the constitutional order. It is, sort of reframing non-racialism in a very dishonest way. It's sort of betraying basic values in the Constitution, but also how it's metastasized is that we've got this racialist legislation like black economic empowerment and affirmative action, which this with this new spin of this redefinition of social justice, which is completely anti-constitutional in the South African legal framework, and the legal system has institutionally corrupted itself in South Africa in order to facilitate this kind of ideological toxicity. Um, they've even, I mean, I keep on bringing this up because it's the most conspicuous example of this, is that they had to invent a governmental prerogative to excuse the judiciary from having to apply the limitations clause to work out if it's justifiable to limit the individual citizen's rights to the practice of equality and the guarantees of social justice and equal protection benefit before the law. That has not been properly administered by the courts. The courts have shirked their duty and they've said, well, the government just has a prerogative to do what it wants as long as it claims that it's trying to do something in the image of what is described in the equality clauses, which empower the government to make policy that targets groups of disadvantaged people. Now, groups of disadvantaged people does not mean uh, a group of people that purportedly can be labeled as a group disadvantaged. It means that the entire category has to be disadvantaged. And so there's a whole lot of semantic fudging and really loose playing around, and the current state of the law is just fundamentally at odds with itself. It has given up on non-racialism quite conspicuously. It's quite disgusting, but it also in a way to protect this ideological sort of disguise of this anti-racist bullshit and all that kind of stuff. They have just invented this governmental prerogative so that they don't even have to work out if this policy is worth the trade-off. That sort of the limitation on, and it also has done lots of weird things because it's given the state this very disgusting situation where it's not responsible for the effects of its own policy. It can always just blame the private sector for not following the governmental mandate. It doesn't actually have to make it never has to be accountable for the effects of its own policy. So you have this disgusting sort of, where the state is increasingly dependent on as having to provide what the private, sort of the private sector, so people are in some sense politically disempowered because they're encouraged to rely on the state for more radical influence and control over resources, and uh, the private sector is in some sense tasked to fulfill the mandate of the government by sort of creating their own experimental, they just have to engage into, sort of very strange forms of redress by, filling quotas or doing something superficial. And so you've got the wrong instruments trying to fulfill the mandate of transformation, and the government essentially does nothing but issuing the mandate. So yeah, I mean, there's a lots of strange role reversals and paradoxes, and in some sense, all of that doesn't really matter. What matters is that, you know organizations like AfriForum, I believe, essentially should not exist, and they should not exist because everything that they want, uh, everything that their activism is centered around, is something that the judiciary should already facilitate it. It should just be a court case that then, the judgment of which affects all the things that AfriForum want should have been able to be sorted out via the judiciary, via the courts. It should not have to be a political or a pseudo political or a semi political, sort of activism movement. This is something that the court should have been responsive to, just using the rights in the Bill of Rights and the limitations clause, and making actual pragmatic, sort of determinations about efficacy of policy and things like that. Is it worth the trade-off? But they have abrogated their role, in our constitutional order, because they've also betrayed they've betrayed the fundamental values of the Constitution, and they have given way to this, sort of weird racialist identitarian nonsense. And anyway, this is the sort of the fundamental corruption that we have to deal with, is that we don't have common standards, we don't have a common sense, or a reasonable, coherent view of what justice might be. Instead, we have to be saddled with, these psychopathic politicians that can leverage all these sympathy extracting, narratives, and they can, you know, play this sort of this seesaw thing where they can talk about the victimization of their identity and their faction, and then that is a justification for some, unaccountable policy that is always overreaching and never responsible for its own efficacy, and the consequences of its own maladministration. So you have, a complete disjunction where you can't even have like a liberal democratic political economy functioning. There can be no consequence in some sense, and this is perhaps mirrored by the fact that there are people in our society which essentially are happy with the lowest common denominator racialist grifting. They are, they like that narrative. They are racial nationalists at the end of the day. And at the end of the day, you need some kind of protection from that. And if it's not going to be the Constitution, if it's not going to be the courts, then I think that we have to try to resurrect the constitutional order with a new territory or something like that. Um, Perhaps a territory that excludes something like the Eastern Cape. I mean, that maybe the Eastern Cape is just simply demographically, there aren't enough people that actually believe in the Constitution. There are not enough people that actually care. It's just window dressing to it's secondary to the racialist, sort of demagoguery that they like to imbibe, and that they, that's the kind of propaganda that they want. That's the kind of politics that they want to be um, handed, and and that they would like to indulge in. And so, I must say, I'm quite despondent myself about the South African sort of situation, because these people in the ANC, even the people supposedly on the right side within the ANC, who are against, sort of the more overt, I know that they pander just as much to the racialist, lowest common denominator form of politics. In some sense, it's the only thing they have as the glue holding them together. So they're so baseless and without actual integrity that's the only thing keeping the show on the road for them. And I wonder how much money has gone into, even in the Cape, um, setting up political parties that have the same racialist tone and the same racialist narrative and the same identitarian chauvinism built into it. So much so that I wonder, if it's even worth it to have an independent Cape, if we're just if we're not going to, if we're not clear about why we would be seceding from the nation, which is because of the betrayal of the Constitution, um, and a need to have a constitutional court that actually upholds the supreme law of the land. And I'll just point out that the provincial constitution is completely, that the Western Cape province itself is plugged into the supremacy of the Constitution. So I would even argue that it's going to be very hard to succeed given the Constitution of the Western Cape, unless you take on the argument that I'm taking on. That the reason for succession is in defense of the supreme law, is in defense of the Constitution, um, and needing a constitutional court that is distinct from the institutionally corrupt body that that might do something like jail the former President Zuma, for contempt of court. But this is a diversion. This is a sideshow. This is quite irrelevant to the institutional corruption and the facilitation of this corrupt politics. Um, I mean, I actually hope that when they see Jacob Zuma's application for rescission, that they extend his sentence, because of the further inflammatory and insightful and the contempt of court that he perpetrated, just before he was arrested. That that the seeds of which we are seeing, in fruition at the moment, in the kind of turmoil, the kind of um, that I mean, this was essentially incited by him before he went to jail. And in some sense now, you imagine that he's almost going to try to blackmail the court, that on the back of all of this civil unrest which he incited, that it's better for everyone if the contempt of court is rescinded. But I mean, it's I would just say that people should actually, they need to start getting used to the fact that President Zuma is going to be in jail, because at some point the corruption convictions need to come in, and in some sense it's probably better if he starts serving time, because I mean, that's if he's ever going to hope to get out of it at some point, because he's been able to avoid justice for over 10 years for the. I mean, he should have been convicted of corruption before he became president 10 years ago. So you've got he's been able to dodge the consequences. He's been able to dodge for already too long. But and which is another sign, in which the politics has corrupted the judiciary in this country, and the legal functioning of things. But yeah, I mean, it's sad that the judiciary has not provided itself more of a compass in our democracy, of being a north star to allow us to more clearly see the political, and to frame what's going on within politics. The courts have actually have been the boiled frog that they have helped to facilitate, the kind of the wholesale corruption, which is in some sense regulated by things like the Promotion of Equality Act, which sort of creates the framework in which you have always these kleptocratic, politically connected, people that are awarded shares and awarded, ownership and become middlemen and add no value, and sort of parasitically impoverish the fundamental, sort of structure of the economy, um, so that we can't actually have organic growth, we can't have real transformation and development, and sort of the skewing of the whole goalposts and the means to transformation get completely transformed into these strange demagoguery of identitarian pride and reclaiming identitarian pride and some kind of social psychology nonsense. Everything is related into, oh, well, people don't have the confidence because they don't have enough tokenism, because there aren't enough role models of their color or something like that. All this blatant, useless, racialist nonsense, disguising the actual pragmatic challenges, education, skills development, actual opportunity, actual, growth in the economy and things like that. All these things are just, sort of replaced by a kind of racial redistribution of pride by taking from some and redistributing to others, by some kind of government intercessor, some intervener and mediator upon the affairs of the private sector. So much so that you have such an anemic and weak private sector that has to sort of enter into this kind of corrupt, situation in which that you get big business is as the only entity that's capable of functioning when it's cozied up to big government, and then you have this unholy alliance, and you have a kind of oligarchy, and it remains to be seen if the black oligarchy, the black nationalist oligarchy, is going to be able to be capable of being dismantled and displaced, or if they've got, I mean, they've institutionally corrupted the law to facilitate them. They've got money and power. They own, sort of media outlets and things like that. Is the democracy already sort of captured um, beyond salvation? And to me, all this stuff about Zuma is, in some sense, on one layer, it is something that does need to happen. That can we actually wrestle with the feudalistic tendencies within sort of the electorate and within sort of the kind of the political demographics of this country, um, but having holding politicians accountable for their quality of leadership and such is is all another important fight that needs to that needs to happen. But you know, quite frankly, the 1994 revolution, the first election, and the new constitution, and the supreme law of South Africa, this has been ravaged. This has been laid to waste. It has been murdered. It has been betrayed. And when are the judges going to be impeached? And judges in some sense can only be impeached by some kind of political function, by voting in Parliament, and you already have such a huge constituency in Parliament of MPs that are basically fascists or black fascists or black racialist national sort of demagogues, and that's their politics, that's their bread and butter. So you've kind of, at some point, I think that it is, in order to save the Constitution, which, I mean, that's what I have my eye on, that prize. That is what needs to happen. And I don't see how that's going to happen without changing the territory of South Africa to exclude certain places that are just too demographically divested from things like the Constitution. They never cared about it. They always wanted their feudal politics or something like that. They never believed in the new South Africa, or or they weren't transformed by it because of the cynical politics. I mean, I do think essentially that what is happening now in KwaZulu Natal just essentially shows that we need a South Africa that has a supreme constitution that you know doesn't include territories that effectively don't value those things. If it's just as simple as that we have to say that these people, they don't want to be South African citizens. They want to be denizens of some identitarian feudal sort of a political structure. That is how they identify themselves. That is how they self-identify. And they are quite frankly happy to use the constitution as toilet paper and to rewrite it as they so wish, to help facilitate their identitarian chauvinism. Like that's they never wanted you know a kind of a common dignity. um, I guess perhaps you can say that this is unfair because this is quite a highly sort of highfalutin, sophisticated sort of way of centering the problem. And yeah, I mean, but yeah, I mean, I'm slightly pedantic because this is the concern that I have, and in some sense, I do think that it's being slightly diluted by some kind of political match. That people want to. The point is that these sorts of things that I'm pointing at are things that should not be a political contest. This should not be politically fought over. We already won the revolution, essentially. We already won the new constitution. The problem is that the constitutional court and the judiciary itself has just fundamentally betrayed the constitution. They have not kept it. They have not upkept it. They have not upheld it. They have let it languish under, the kind of the foggy rhetoric of this new speak of social justice, meaning sort of this racialist chauvinism, very very thinly disguised. And I, it's I mean, I guess if you had a functioning, well functioning enough, sort of civil society, perhaps there would be a grassroots to impeach these judges and sort of cleanse the system. Um, but the political structure is, in some sense, was the nexus of this poison, and in some sense, the electorate has consistently gone along with it. Enough of the electorate endorses this, and so I mean, it seems to me it is appropriate to redraw the territory. It is appropriate to say, well, we have to disassociate from large centers of politically minded people within the geographical layout of the country, that they just essentially they endorse politics which is just anti-constitutional. They don't believe in the constitution. They don't believe in non-racialism, and it was all just window dressing to facilitate the way that all of these corrupt, unaccountable politics develop. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, I would at some point blame the ANC itself because in some sense you could say that they have cynically invested in enlarging a democratic deficit, in facilitating this corrupt politics. And if apartheid was labeled a crime against humanity, I believe that the ANC government is a greater crime against humanity in terms of the damage that it has done to its own constitution. When I say its own constitution, I mean the constitution of the country. Um, the betrayal that it has perpetrated against that. Um, but it is sad that uh, the people themselves essentially are diverted by sort of these other things, which, in my view, are perhaps they're more practical on some level, but sort of they're symptoms of the deeper cause, which is essentially that the Constitution has been subverted, and it's been subverted for very poor reasons. Like academic freedom, so that we could have agendas and race departments at universities, that they could promulgate this anti-constitutional propaganda and create the kind of toxic culture, the pseudo-intellectualism needed in order to, facilitate the politicians, sort of creating things like the Promotion of Equality Act, and then getting the judges to protect that disgusting legislation by calling it covered by the governmental prerogative, and therefore not doing their job, um, in actually seeing if this policy uh, is efficaciously worth it, which it obviously isn't. I mean, it also facilitates basic corruption, but it also impels people towards a disgusting form of racial consciousness, because that is how the regulations operate. In some sense, um, we never should have removed from people's identity documents their racial designation. You used to have a number in your identity document that would tell you what race you were. Why did we ever do away with that if the whole fucking government apparatus is based on what fucking race you are? Like the hypocrisy, the paradox, the contradictions are so conspicuous, or so obvious. And what do the judges do? They and they are, and they say, well, there's a governmental prerogative, so let's not even think about it. Let's not even think about the fucking disgusting contradictions that we are involved in the betrayal of the supreme law. I mean, these people. I mean, there's a circle of hell waiting to receive these people. I believe, because I do see them as the proximate cause of the Judas of the Brutus, stabbing in the back. These are and the damage that they have done. I mean, if apartheid was a crime, what these people have done, these are like the German officers. These are like Goebbels and Goering and Himmler. These are the top brass. These are the people that were complicit in the destruction of a constitutional order. Impeachment. I mean, I believe that they should even serve some kind of penalty for their constitutional damages, for their complicity in their constitutional damages, but also how they have facilitated the corruption in the state, by their, you can't even call it complacency. I mean, I think it's a form of, there is a corrupt mentality here. There's a corrupt ideological. I mean, these people, they have sold their souls to racialism, is what they have done. They have believed in this idolatry of social justice. They have taken it in, and it's as long as they can just keep on the semantic game playing, they can keep on labeling everyone who disagrees with them, who doesn't believe in their moral superiority, and getting on their soapbox and talking down to people and saying, well, if you don't agree with this, then you're a racist. If you don't accept the racial designation that the policy is inducting you into, seeing the world through in order to justify its own disgusting, superficial bestowment of a redistributed, dignity. I mean, why can't you just have policy that targets disadvantage directly? Then at least we wouldn't have this problem of helping these rich people get richer, as I mean, and what the hell is the point of that? Because it's good for you when your identity is made stronger because a few people are made super rich. I mean, like, because the problem was really that you didn't have a role model. You didn't see someone that was the same color as you being super successful, and that had a psychological problem for you. So now we're fixing that. Is what we're trying to fix. I mean, it's disgusting. I mean, if the moral and principled bankruptcy of this whole, you know, system of pseudo transformation and artificial empowerment, the kind of the imposters that it has created, and then the secondary sort of psychological psychopathy in order to legitimize these imposters, which is and playing. I mean, it's a disgusting diversion that is just, it's made for the production of demagogues. It's made for the production of unaccountable politicians using more and more emotionally, sort of charged and unreasonable, and all of these strange moral panic and hysterical, kinds of ways of framing that it's okay to that this is the necessary means, that is all justified by the ends. It's that kind of reality tunnel, and and these people, they have all sold their souls to that. They're as bad as any other fascist or racist. I mean, it's the same blinders. It's the same reality tunneling, that you can't even see common sense. You can't even see, because all of morality is part of your means to an end. Everyone needs to change their perception to plug into this collective delusion that the imposters are the means to the end, or something like that. Uh, and then you can then create other disgusting things, like call it hate speech when anyone points out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes, which is what this whole project essentially is. It's designed to fail, so that as it fails, it can blame a scapegoat, and then it can amplify the anger that it has at that scapegoat. It's a scapegoat based morality. It's based on a conspiracy, and then you end up having to believe that the conspiracy is the true cause of everything. Just like the Nazis had their Jewish conspiracy, these people have their conspiracy of white monopoly capital and white male privilege and all that bullshit. It's exactly. I mean, this is what the race and gender studies are at the university. It's the same thing as Aryan studies, just instead of Darwinism and genetic theory, it's slightly more esoteric this time, but it's the same bullshit. It's that people inherit a kind of moral superiority because of the lived experience of their identity. I mean, how is that different from blood and soil? It's the same mythological bullshit. So that's what we're sitting with. That's the corruption that we're sitting with, and a judiciary that didn't do its function of protecting society, so that because really, AfRiform should not exist. It should have been a court case, and the court case should have been over, and then they wouldn't need. I mean, the judiciary isn't doing its job. That's what the existence of AfRiform. What it means is that the judiciary is defunct. The judiciary is useless. They have betrayed the Constitution. That's what the existence of AfRiform means. Because when the government wants to have policy, it can't just say that it has a governmental prerogative when it is doing things and it's stopping other people from administering their affairs in such a way that actually, when they dismantled the sort of the rural police force that farmers had put together to protect their communities and things like that, like that they did. I mean, it's quite frankly, the racial chauvinism and the identitarian, sort of revenge and racial, uh, uh, this kind of racialist nationalism that the courts are have gone beyond. They have invented things essentially in order not to do their function. It is disgusting. Um, And because the South African legal system did actually have a solution to this stuff, but the courts have not fulfilled their role. They've betrayed their own values, and we need a legitimate constitutional court, essentially. Um, to me, that is the drive for any kind of succession for the Western Cape. That, I think, has to be the overarching winning argument. But I mean, the reason why I'm despondent is because there are a lot of people. The Cape Coloured Congress, the Patriotic Alliance. I mean, these are basically they are really trying to have the same politics as the EFF and the racial faction. I mean, in some sense, the whole ANC always pays lip service to this racial nationalism now. Um, it's quite confused in some sense because half the time they say non-racialism, and then you have Tito Mboweni talking about how the non-racialism is all basically about his interpretation of identity politics. And he has quite the same kinds of he sets up the same polemic that Julius Malema sets up, just in slightly more passive tones. But it's the same formula. It's the same formula of unaccountable politics and diverting blame onto a scapegoat. It's exactly the same formula. Um, which is why, anyway. So the democratic deficit has. I mean, maybe I'm talking too soon because maybe we have to see, what certain government election results will be, to see where the electorate sort of stands on these issues. But I do think that there's a certain political reality that many people fundamentally they repudiate the Constitution, and that doesn't function. You can't have a society that doesn't have a consensus over the Constitution, and the Constitution has it has been institutionally sabotaged as well. So there are a lot of problems here, and I don't really know how to address them, except if you kind of make an argument towards succession over the grounds that I have laid down, then I think you actually have the right political. You start having the right political debate, and the right political lines start being drawn in the sand that actually facilitate, I would say, a productive political debate. Which is, in some sense, for me, it's not important if succession happens or not. It's more that this is the debate that needs to be had. This is the issue that needs to be had. That we need a revivified judiciary. We need a cleansed judiciary, and we need a judiciary that's capable of actually um, clamping down on this anti-constitutional propaganda and constitutional damages, um, which in some sense, isn't in some sense politically possible with perhaps being conjoined with certain territories where there are just where the electorate is just basically so invested into identitarian chauvinism and some form of tribal nationalism or black nationalism. Um,